Welcome, everyone, to the Here Brotherhood podcast. We are thrilled to have Michael Anderson on with us today. We are your hosts. I'm Michael Allen.
And I'm John Moore.
And thanks for joining us. Michael, thanks for being here.
Oh, yeah, totally. Thanks for having me, guys.
We're so excited to have you.
Yeah.
So we met you, I think, through the online world, whether it was LinkedIn or the Here Brotherhood. I mean, you joined at some point, and we connected on, just you're doing amazing work, and it really resonated with us. And we had you on for a Here Talk way back.
That's right.
You remember that one?
Yeah, that was awesome.
It was so good. And we've been meaning to have you on for a long time. So I'm glad it finally has worked out to have you here.
Yeah, same.
We have been trying to get you on for a while.
It makes it sound like I've had like this super busy schedule. You know?
It's both of us.
Yeah, exactly. No,
it's all our fault.
Yeah.
It is.
No, so tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, the work that you specialize in, because from what we've seen you talk about, there's a pretty wide range of things that you cover. It's relationships, it's individuals, it's therapy, it's coaching, it's an IFS, internal family systems has been an influence there. So I'm stealing your introduction here by saying all this stuff, but why don't you say it back in the words that you would choose?
Cool. No, yeah.
Go ahead.
It's driving me crazy.
Yeah.
There was a hair.
It's okay. I once had a fly on my microphone during a podcast the entire time. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Before I do my introduction, can I just say, really stoked to be with you guys. Finally, again, we've been online together, you know, but to actually be in a room with you guys talking is really cool. So thanks.
Love it.
So by training, I'm a marriage and family therapist. And so just to give you an answer to, what I'm about. And you said I focus on a lot of different issues and fields. And the reason why is because in my training as marriage and family therapist, I was working a lot with couples, I was working a lot with families, I was working a lot with individuals. And as I was doing that training, I started learning a lot about trauma and trauma healing and the effect that trauma has in our relationships. And I realized that it actually doesn't matter whether you're trying to heal a marriage, heal your family, heal yourself. It kind of all boils down to the same issues, and that is learning how to go inside and heal what's going on inside of us so that we can show up more powerfully for the people who matter most in our lives. And so it's been a passion of mine to help in all those different areas because I think it all kind of boils down to the same thing.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so let's
I have a few questions.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Well, so, and this is speaking on behalf of some of the people that I talk to a lot, or some of the world that I'm in, where there's some skepticism about trauma. And there's some people in my life that are like, oh, everybody has trauma. Yeah. And they just are so turned away by the word trauma because it's so overused.
Totally.
And everybody's blaming trauma for every little hardship in life, right? And so I just would love for you to tell us a little bit more about what that means. And does everybody have trauma, and the different range of trauma, whatever you want to tell us about trauma. But I'm just kind of addressing those people.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually really glad you asked that because I totally agree with you. I think so. It's human nature to overcorrect from one extreme to the other extreme. Yeah. And I think where we've shifted a lot in society is it was like we don't ever talk about trauma, right? There's like a mental health stigma, and we've overcorrected in some ways to, I think now, over talking about it, right? And almost to this point of people, it creates this sense of like victimhood to trauma, which I think is one reason why people don't want to talk about it. It's like everyone just says, oh, I did this because I'm traumatized, or they did this because they're traumatized, where it just takes away so much self-accountability and is so much like self-liberation, right? Because we're just becoming a victim to that, right? Which I think is a big reason why a lot of people get turned off to this idea of trauma. And so I love talking about trauma because I think there is a appropriate way to do that is actually really liberating. And so, all right, so I use the word trauma. I'm going to simplify what trauma is, because a lot of people think that trauma is it has to be these like really big things, right? Which obviously that is a part of it. But trauma is any overly distressing life event that our brain didn't know how to process. And so now it's affecting us in our present moment. And so to your question of like, does everyone have trauma? I don't know anybody who hasn't experienced an overly distressing life event that their body hasn't figured out how to process yet, right? And
one way that we've talked about it before, and I'm interested if you agree or if there needs to be some clarification.
Sure.
One way we've talked about it before is like little t trauma and then, big T trauma, which is the abuse, which is the really traumatic. Because I think a lot of people that I've talked to, when they think of trauma, they think of like a traumatic experience, like a car accident, or abuse, or like these really huge things.
Huge things, yeah.
And so when they say, I don't have trauma, I think a lot of them mean it, but they mean big T trauma.
Yeah.
So is that a correct thing to or is that oversimplifying it by just giving it two names?
No, I think that's absolutely a thing, and we use that in the psychology kind of trauma space. Me personally, I think the only issue I have with talking about big T and little T trauma is I don't want anyone to think I have little T trauma, therefore what I've experienced isn't as valid or important
meaningful,
as someone or meaningful as someone who's experienced what we call big T trauma.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So that could go the other way too.
Sure.
Like I've experienced big T trauma, and therefore
100%, right?
Well, and how often do we hear people say like, "Oh, you think your problems are big? Like you should look at my life." And then and so there's
like
this
someone's
cycle
like,
of,
how many little T traumas does it take to get like one big T?
Yeah. Or from when is the transition between little T and big T?
Yeah, exactly.
It's tricky.
And I think the important thing is the distinction is trauma is not the event. Trauma is the effect it had on our brain. In which case, I don't know if
Will you say that again?
Yeah. Trauma is not the event. Trauma is the effect it had on our brain.
Okay.
And the reason why that's important is because two people could go through the same exact experience, and it's not a guarantee that both of them get traumatized, right? They actually done really cool studies like on 9/11 survivors, right? And children who were involved in 9/11, and a portion of them experienced clinical trauma and others didn't for various reasons. And I don't know if it's helpful to really dive into that at all. But for the sake of explanation, right? That's why I usually just try, instead of using big T and little t, I just try and meet people where they're at and say, listen, what you're experiencing, we waste so much time judging ourselves by what we shouldn't or shouldn't be feeling rather than just being present with what is, right? So if that affected you, own it. And it doesn't make you weak that it affected you. In fact, it's probably the most liberating thing you can do is finally sit down with it, because then you can actually heal it and do something about it. So that's my approach to that.
That's beautiful.
When you shared that definition, it just reminded me of a little soundbite that I've heard from Gabor Mate, and he's kind of paraphrasing, like I think it's like a Buddhism, philosophy idea. But he says we don't respond to what happens to us. We respond to our perception of what happens to us.
Yeah.
Would you say that's another way of saying?
Yeah.
It? Okay.
But I love Gabor Mate.
Yeah.
He's just a brilliant mind, and that I love that.
Cool. Okay. So tell us a little bit about sitting with, let's say, our traumas or our wounds, and because that's kind of where you took it, right? Is like, okay, however we're going to define it doesn't actually really, that's not the important part. The important part is, are we willing to go there, sit there, and do some work around it?
Yeah.
And you referred a few times to this idea of healing, of like finding healing or receiving that or discovering that, whatever that process looks like. Could you like tell us a little bit about how you help people go through the process of healing?
Yeah, totally. So the way, so just broadly speaking, trauma is another way to define trauma, right? As it's marked by a significant lack of connection. Meaning when we experience trauma, it affects our ability to connect either with ourselves or with other people. I mean, that's why trauma is so distressing, right? Is because it's not the event, it's the fact that our brain hasn't processed it, and so it keeps us from being able to find genuine connection, either with ourselves or with other people. Therefore, the antidote to healing trauma is connection. That's how we heal trauma. And again, there are two layers of connection. There's connection with others, which is why I love things like Here Brotherhood, right? Those types of communities. But where a level of connection that most people, so many people are absolutely starved for, is connection with self. Yeah. Connection with self is what begins the healing of trauma. And so whenever I work with clients, it's all about taking them, they come with this mindset of, these parts of me are really scary. I don't like spending time with them. And I do everything I can to avoid them, shove them away, ignore them, dismiss them, minimize them. And I tell them, okay, if we're going to work together, there's just one thing I need you to buy in on. And it's okay if you don't buy in on it. We don't have to work together. But if we're going to work together, you have to buy in on this. And that is the way to finally heal this is to actually stop running from it and actually pull those parts of us close and get curious with those parts of us and actually learn how to start loving these parts of ourselves.
Mm.
And that's what heals trauma, is because we can't change the past, obviously, but we can change, to that Gabor Mate quote, the perception around it.
Yeah.
This perception of these are weak, bad parts of me to these are actually parts of me that I love. Some really unfair things happened to them. They didn't deserve that. And now I can take care of these parts of me.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And that, what you're sharing right now is internal family systems references there,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, totally.
So I think some people have heard of what this is. It's sometimes referred to as just IFS.
Yeah.
Could you give us a little bit of context of what is internal family systems?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
Totally. So the idea of IFS, or internal family systems, so it's a trauma-informed therapeutic approach, is developed by a man named Richard Schwartz. Really brilliant guy. He's a PhD therapist, very, very intelligent man. And the idea is he discovered as he's working with clients that we all use this vernacular of parts, right? Like, I don't know if you guys have ever used this, talked about this idea of like, I don't know if you guys ever said something like, part of me really loves that guy, and a part of me just also wants to punch him in the face, right? Like, part of me loves being healthy, but a part of me loves to eat ice cream all the, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And as he worked with clients, he realized that these parts are not just simply a vernacular, but actually our psyches. That's a normal state of our psyches to be subdivided into parts. The neuroscience is starting to catch up with this idea. And again, depending on how deep you want to go into, I'm happy to explain as much. But just again, a simple bird's eye view of IFS. The idea is that we all our psyche subdivided into parts, and these parts are all working to try and either protect us, keep us safe, right? Help us feel loved in the world, right? Some parts, because of trauma or overly distressing life events, right? They get forced into really extreme roles. Because there are parts of ourselves that are damaged from the trauma, right? We experience trauma and parts of ourselves get stuck there that feel like, because of what happened to us, we believe we're unsafe, we're unlovable, we're inadequate, right? Emotions are bad, emotions are scary, right? I can't trust anybody. And so other parts of our psyche step in to try and protect us from ever having to face that pain, right? So if I have a part of me that feels really unlovable, maybe whenever I'm with my wife and she criticizes me, I might have a protector part that steps in and says, and gets really defensive, right? And starts shifting blame to her, all because she's doing something that's activating this trigger, this traumatized part in me that feels unlovable, right?
Yeah.
Is that making enough sense when I'm how I'm describing it?
Totally. You kind of just touched on the word trigger there. Like, is that a word that you use, like triggering events? Like,
yeah, if you know, I said the word, then I quickly walked it. I shifted words because I actually try my best to avoid the word trigger.
Why is that?
Possible. Because it's
triggering for a lot of people.
Yeah. to your point, your very first question, right? When I talk about how we swung to this other extreme over talking about it. Now triggers become like this pop culture, this pop psychology word where someone gets angry and they say, well, they triggered me, right? You're like, no, that's not being triggered. That's just poor emotional regulation, right? The actual trauma sense, right, means something happens that triggers a part of our nervous system that's still stuck in the unprocessed trauma, right? This is what reacts. And so, but to avoid this overuse of the word trigger, I actually like to use the term activated more, right? So this activates the parts of a part of us, right? So anyways, so that's, I started using the trigger and then I walked it back quickly because I'm trying to get out of the habit of using that term.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's literally why I pounced on that. I was like, wait a minute, you said trigger, but then
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. That's
so
helpful.
I have a question about that, about these triggers, and just trauma in general. I've heard it said that trauma gets stuck in time.
Yeah.
Meaning I know somebody who they act a certain way because this is my analysis of it from what I've heard.
Yes.
Is that they act a certain way, the same way they've acted since they were 14 years old.
100%. Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure something happened at that stage of their life because they can't emotionally move on from it, and they can't regulate beyond a 14-year-old.
Yes.
And so that rings true for me. So I'd love for you to talk about that because I think that's such a fascinating concept and scary that
Yeah.
that trauma can be stuck in time.
Yes.
That people can be stuck in time because of the trauma
Right.
Yeah.
that they've experienced.
Yeah. So let me just explain that real quick.
Yeah.
That's really fascinating for me too. What I tell clients is you have one physical age, but you have actually multiple emotional ages, right?
Sorry, can you say that again?
You have one physical age,
Okay.
but you have multiple emotional
Yeah.
ages
Okay.
living inside of your nervous system. And here's why. So this is kind of oversimplified, but just for the sake of explanation, right? So there's a part of your brain called your hippocampus. And the point of your hippocampus, one of its functions is to timestamp memories. Okay. So you have an experience, right? It gets kind of processed through your midbrain. It gets sent to the hippocampus. And 99% of the time, your hippocampus just kind of timestamps it and sends it off to long-term memory, right? Which is why you can like think back on things in 2017 and you can feel a sense of distance, a sense of separation. Here I am right now, and that happened back in 2017. You can kind of feel that distance, right? When we experience trauma, right? Again, or an overly distressing life event, right? What happens, things get interfered with that time stamping process. The hippocampus can't do it. And so what it does is it kind of panics. It's like, just shove this away, right? And the memory gets filed, but it's not time stamped. And so then when you go through life, let's say 10 years pass, something happens that reminds your brain of that untimestamped memory. As far as your brain is concerned, that part gets reactivated and it hasn't been timestamped. So your brain thinks you're back in that danger. Like you're reliving it. You're back in that present moment, right? Which is why you can be in your 40s. But if you have an experience that you haven't processed when you were 14, that part of your nervous system gets sent online because it hasn't been processed yet. That memory hasn't been timestamped. And so now you're reacting in the same way that you would have when you were 14, right? And which is really fascinating, right? And so a lot of trauma healing is actually going and reprocessing that memory so that your hippocampus can finally timestamp it and say, oh, that's in the past. We don't need to worry about it anymore, right? We're not in danger anymore, which is why there's a really common term in psychology called inner child work, which a lot of people, including myself, when I first learned about inner child work, was like, that is so cheesy.
Same.
I don't need to like visualize my younger 5-year-old self and give him a hug. Like I don't need to do any of that stuff. That's so cheesy. Just like focus on the here and now and move on with your life, right?
Yes.
Until I better understood the neuroscience, like we're not just like talking about fluffy imagery. Like there actually are parts of our nervous system that are stuck back there. And so when we get really curious with them and spend time with them, often those parts do manifest as these younger children, right? And so it's not actually cheesy and fluffy. It's actually just how your brain is wired to either store trauma or to finally heal it.
I love that because I recently found out that most of your belief system is formed before the age of 7.
Yeah.
And so I think, okay, if that's true, then there's some things that are useful to go back to and try and change those beliefs for that 7-year-old.
Yeah.
Because that will affect me. And my favorite visualization I've seen is from my friend Nikki, and I swear I've referenced this 100 times on this podcast. So for the faithful listeners,
It's the first time for me though.
Okay, great. I think of Nikki used a tree stump. He has a little slice of a tree stump, and he shows all of the rings, and at the very center is the sapling. And that sapling is always going to be there. It has to be, because that's the center, that's the core of who we are. And so,
wow, that's cool.
I love
concentric growth.
That visualization for me has always been so helpful, because I used to feel the same way about inner child. I used to think it was like this fluffy thing, and then he explained it to me. I'm like, oh, it's because it's just that it's the inner child is the visualization of the core of who we have always been.
Yeah.
And it's a representation of that, and I love that, and that helped me to get kind of past the idea of it being this fluffy
that's cool
practice.
I love that.
But I just think that's so powerful to think, okay, if I can go and change what's at that core, and that what do you call it? Concentric?
The concentric growth that comes from that sapling. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
We always have that sapling as a part of us, and I think that's just powerful.
That's pretty rad. I love that. That's cool.
You've mentioned a few times like processing.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about what you mean when you say, okay, there's things that we weren't capable of processing, or we haven't gone back to, or we haven't in a healthy way processed an event that was overwhelming or whatever. So what does that kind of look like to say, okay, there's something here that needs to be felt, dealt with, experienced, whatever,
Yes.
what does it look like to process in a healthy way?
Totally. Yeah. So let me start by, to answer that question, let me start by what unhealthy processing looks like. Or maybe I should say unhealthy, but ineffective.
Okay.
Because there's lots of unhealthy processing, like numbing out and everything.
Sure.
But unhelpful processing looks like trying to logic your way out of trauma, right? So to experience,
What does that look like?
like saying, dude, I was like 5, get over it by now, right? Like I'm like 40, right? Like like, hey, I was, or even more compassionate logic, right? Like you can say things like, you know, I was a kid, I didn't know better, right? Like I can move on. That's true,
Right.
but the only problem is it doesn't actually change the emotional center of your body most of the time. And what I mean by that sounds really vague. So let me explain, right? So to experience trauma is an emotional event. It is emotionally distressing. Let's use the example of like a 5-year-old, right? Who had a dad who just would yell at him all the time and criticize him all the time. Okay. That's an emotional experience for that 5-year-old, right? That it's affecting his nervous system, right? Not just it's not a logical experience for the kid. It's actually affecting his body, right? And so what that kid doesn't know, that kid doesn't know that dad was at the edge of losing his job, right? His grandpa had mentally and emotionally abused his dad, right? Growing up. And so his dad didn't know how to show up emotionally for this 5-year-old kid, right? It was never modeled to him. He was experiencing intense stress at work. Him and his wife are on the brink of a divorce, right? The 5-year-old kid doesn't know any of that bigger story. All he sees is his dad yelling at him, screaming at him, always criticizing him, right? And the 5-year-old doesn't feel safe. And it's actually safer for a child to internalize that something must be wrong with them than it is to believe that something could be wrong with their caregiver. That's like infinitely more scary than just believing something's wrong with them, right? And so that's
that's Superman.
Yeah, exactly.
Him, right?
Yeah, it's like if they're supposed to keep me safe. Like if Superman can't do it, then like how am I supposed to be safe in this world?
So you're saying they don't even have the capacity really to understand that Superman could be infallible.
Exactly.
It's just a safety mechanism to.
It's a safety mechanism. That would be so scary to think if like the 2 people who are meant to keep you safe can't do their job. That's really scary, right? So it's much safer to feel something's wrong with me. They're fine. I'll work to improve. I'll change. And that's how inner critics get born, right? These inner critics that say, all right, we've got to change and improve. So let me kick the crap out of you until we can finally improve, right? So all these other things, right? So years go by and they need, in order to heal the emotional experience of the trauma, they need what we call in psychology a corrective emotional experience. We heal emotion with emotion. We don't heal emotion with logic. And so there has to be a process where we actually go and go back and revisit those memories and revisit the parts of us that are stuck in those memories, right? Neurologically frozen in time, right? And have a new emotional experience with them. And that's what IFS does. That's why IFS is so powerful. There's other forms of therapy like CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy, which definitely has benefits, but one of the main limitations is that it's a very logical approach, right? Yeah. And so there's lots of what we call recidivism rates with CBT, meaning there's not long-term change in CBT, but eventually people fall back in old cycles, right? So you actually need to go, and that's why inner child work is so powerful. That's why I would contend why a lot of like the stuff you guys do with your retreats, why people say they have such powerful experiences, is because they're having a new emotional experience with their trauma, where they're not just sitting with their 5-year-old self and logically thinking like, dude, that kid just didn't know, right? They're actually emotionally feeling love for that kid. They're like, oh my gosh, I love that kid. I love him. I just want to, and I talk with clients. IFS is a very meditative process, right? And I have them close their eyes and kind of be with those parts of them. I'm like, what do you want to do for that kid right now? They just say, I just want to hold that kid and just cry with him. And they do. They just like weep there in the room. And they just like, I just want to tell him that like, he's okay. Like he's such a good, beautiful kid. But now it's not logical anymore. It's emotional. And that's what reprocesses the memory in our brain. And the hippocampus can finally be like, timestamp, done, in the past. We're ready to move forward.
You've left me speechless.
Hopefully that's helpful.
Well, so I'm
awesome.
thinking, I'm actually feeling a little like it's a little bit emotional for me for the experience that you shared,
Hmm.
because I'm going through a little bit of that right now, and I'm not trying to make this about me, but I'm like,
Yeah.
you're sharing about a dad and a 5-year-old. I'm there's and I'm like, I don't know how much to share, because if my 5-year-old ever listens to this, I'm like, I love you, and also
Parenting is really hard.
parenting is really hard. There's it's pretty frequent where I'm I'm a really good dad. I just want to clarify, but there are moments, but I want to be a great dad, right?
Mhm.
But there are moments where I just totally lose it on my 6-year-old,
Mhm.
because because maybe there's some trauma there for me, but there's just such a struggle to feel like I'm doing what I can for him, and I'm like, oh man, I feel like what I just said, or what
Yeah.
the way that I just handled that he's gonna talk about it in therapy sometimes. Sometimes I joke about that, and I'm not like screaming at him, but I just get short with him, because he's just not listening after the 20th try of being patient,
Yeah.
right? I'm like,
Yeah.
come on, just
Yeah.
get going, or
Yeah.
like, why don't you understand? Or I'll
Totally.
just say something, I'm like, I knew that wasn't the right. So when that happens, um, if you were to look at my situation, how can I go about that so that those times that I have made him not feel safe?
Yeah.
Because I want to be that safe place. I
Yeah.
really do, for my kids, but sometimes I'm not.
Yes.
And I want to be. So how does that get repaired in this situation, for example, where I would like to be able to repair some of those moments where he hasn't felt safe,
Yeah.
and and be that safe place for him moving forward.
Yeah. But first of all, by the way, the best parents ask that question. Just so you know, right? Like, it's the parents that don't ask those questions,
work.
right? That say like, I'm good. I don't need to change, right? The best
I
parents.
can't imagine feeling that way. Like,
You'd
oh,
be-
I'm fine.
You'd be surprised.
Okay. Well,
Like the parents that ask those questions are the ones that usually are on the right track, right? And here's what's really cool. So I just explained through IFS that process of emotionally going back and re-experiencing the memory, right? Now, for that person who's 40 years old and they have a dad who isn't willing to go there with them and repair, IFS is all about going there meditatively with those parts of you and giving love, right? Helping to heal. What's awesome is that parents have the opportunity to do that exact thing with their kids through repair work, right? When we go to our kids and we say, dude, can you just come here for a second? Just sit up here. Let me talk to you for a moment. Hey, man, dad's really working on himself. What dad did wasn't right. Just so you know, I'm having a hard time regulating my stress, and I took it out on you. And you're like such an awesome kid. I'm so sorry I did that to you. You didn't deserve that. I'm really, really sorry. You didn't deserve it. That's one of the most powerful phrases we can tell our kids. You didn't deserve it. You hug them, you hold them, you say, listen, I'm really trying to get better at this, but I just want you to know every time I get this wrong, I'm going to come back and I'm going to say sorry, because this is not about you. It's about me. That is healing. That's the IFS process that we do individually on ourselves, but you get to do it with your kids so they don't have to go to therapy someday and do that work.
Right.
I've never once, I work a lot with it. Like, what I love to do is I love to work with parents, because nothing like parenting shines a light on our insecurities, right?
Yeah.
And I love to work with parents, and I've worked with a ton of parents, and I've never once heard any parent say, you know what? I'm really bummed. I'm really damaged. I'm really hurt that my parents weren't perfect. They've never said that. What I have heard multiple times is they say, my dad never apologized to me. And I can't remember the last time he said, I'm sorry. I can't remember the last time my mom said, I love you. Like, that's the stuff that affects children.
Yeah.
It's not the imperfections of our parents, right? When we repair, when we go to them, when we let them know this was not about you, this is about me, you didn't deserve that, we're teaching their brain to have that perspective that they don't need to go get later in life. Like, they're learning it with you in real time, right? So
I really appreciate that. And so here's where my mind went is almost I kind of fear that conversation, and I'm actually decent at asking for forgiveness.
cool.
Which I'm happy to hear about that, because at least I'm good at repairing things there.
Yeah, good.
I keep making mistakes, but I'll at least ask for an apology. But where my mind goes is the fear of having that conversation sometimes is that I don't want them to see me as like a superhero that's fallen, right? Like, oh, dad is working on himself. Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Does that mean that he doesn't know what he's doing? Like, I want them to feel that safety. And so sometimes I think that's the vulnerability, the worry of being vulnerable with my kids.
Yeah.
Which is probably silly, but.
Yeah, I think no, it's not silly at all. It makes a lot of sense, especially because you're coming at it from this intent of I want my kids to feel like they can trust me, right? I want my kids to feel safe with me, right? And if I'm fallen Superman, like what does that mean, right? We think one of the biggest. So for me, one of my biggest vulnerabilities, insecurities with parenting is when my kids cry. Especially when my sons cry. I've got 2 sons and I've got a little baby girl, and when my sons cry, especially early on, it would evoke like a pretty cold response from me, right? Like, dude, like I wouldn't say suck it up to him, but I would say, like get over it, man. Like take a deep breath. Like, come on, man. Like everyone's watching, everyone's looking at you, right? And I realized that had way more to do with my own insecurities, obviously, than like letting him be a kid, right? And I thought that being respected as a dad meant that they listened to me all the time. It was compliance, right? So when I said, stop crying, get over it, right? That they listened right away. I'm like, sweet, I'm respected. This is awesome, right? They respect me. They see me as a strong, powerful figure. And then I learned that actually what builds respect for our children, what builds respect for their parent in a child's eyes is connection. When they feel connected to their parent, that's what builds respect. It's not always listening, and it's not this like fear of their parent that builds respect. It's this feeling of connection, and connection is on the other side of vulnerability, but vulnerability is on the other side of discomfort, which is why we don't get vulnerable, right, with our kids. So it's a leap of faith to say, I'm actually going to get vulnerable. I'm going to be open with my weaknesses and my mistakes, and I'm going to trust that vulnerability is going to lead to genuine connection with my kid.
So amazing. Okay, I love that we're coming back to this concept of connection, because when we started this conversation, you were like, disconnection is the result of these, I'm trying not to use the word trauma again,
right.
these experiences that we couldn't fully understand or process. You have your better definition of that. But so so what I'm hearing from John too is like, okay, there's this tendency to react a certain way, and that you can do the repair work, right? It's like, okay, I lost my temper, I got frustrated, I acted this way. Okay, now I can be vulnerable with my kid if I'm willing to get a little uncomfortable and like reconnect with that kid. But you talked about how powerful that internal connection work is, and that's where my mind's going with John in this example is like, is there a way to do the kind of inner work where maybe I'm not so inclined to lose my temper over something because I'm not as what's the word? Not triggered, but activated, right?
Yeah, there you go.
I'm like watching my vocabulary with you now. And so maybe there's like, do you see it this way? Like there's kind of 2 sides to this dynamic. There's the external relationship connection, and then there's the internal relationship connection. And where would that maybe lead? And it's not just John, it's all of us, right? To getting to a place, and maybe this is an imaginary world that I have in my head, but I imagine sometimes, what would it look like to feel so good with myself and whole, and like I've done the healing work that I just don't get that triggered or upset anymore, or I don't get activated in the ways that I used to, and then I'm not sort of dishing out my reactivity on others, where it's like I'm in a pretty good place, but I don't know if that's even attainable in this life, to be like I'm invulnerable suddenly, right? But maybe my relationship with that changes in some way, right? And I'm less reactive.
Boom.
Okay. So why don't you speak
That's
to
honestly really fast. That's honestly as you're talking, I'm thinking that for me is that's how I know I've won. Meaning like I strive for that goal so much, and I keep failing. And so I think I put that on myself of like, I am never going to be a good enough father. I'm never like, because I'm like, I'm giving him 20 chances patiently. I'm like, my limit has been reached. So the 21st time you're gonna get the wrath of dad.
Yep.
But to get to that point where I'm like, I'm never losing to them. Not that it's a win-lose game, but just where they don't see that. Like that, what you just described is kind of my end game. Like I want
How
that
do I get
now.
there? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So what I tell clients a lot, I'm like, all right, here's what I want you to do. From here on out, I want you to stop viewing pain as bad to be avoided, right? And one of the biggest misconceptions we have is we believe healing is the absence of pain. That's what we believe.
Mm.
And that's not true. It's
Yeah.
actually very far from the truth, right?
Mm.
Healing is not the absence of pain. Healing is the ability to be with our pain, with curiosity, with compassion, with flexibility. And so, yes, there are things we can do to bring down our reactivity. Totally. Like this type of work that we're talking about, right? And because life is hard and we're humans, we're never going to be done with our pain. And so it's all about prioritizing flexibility with our pain. Like, how good are we at just being with our pain? Like when our kid doesn't listen for the 21st time, how good are we at just sitting with our pain and saying, this makes sense, this is frustrating. I can be with this, right? I don't need to avoid this. In fact, I tell people, like, people will say, like, so you want me to just be with my anger? So you want me to just yell at my kids? I'm like, no, obviously. In fact, I would actually say that you yelling at your kids is a sign that you're actually not willing to be with your pain.
Mm.
Yelling when we feel angry is an avoidance tactic, right? It's saying, I don't like what I'm feeling inside of me. I need to release this, right? And so we yell, right? And so it's learning how to actually be with our pain, what we're feeling, right? From this really like gentle, safe, like curious, compassionate way, right? And that's to your question. I think I can't remember if you asked me before we recorded or at the very beginning of the recording of like, when do we know if like, is it good to get therapy or
Right.
when do we need it? Right? What I would say is, listen, if you are experiencing a cycle that you're having a really hard time being flexible with, like the space between stimulus and response is just so short that you don't, it's so hard for you to actually sit with and be with it, then that's a great indication that, hey, go get some tools in therapy, build the mindfulness circuitry in your brain to learn how to sit with what you're feeling in a really gentle way, right? Like that, I think that could be a really strong indication that that's helpful for someone. And now, I don't even know, have I answered you guys' question? I can't even remember fully what the question was that you guys asked.
It was about the internal work to help, and you are speaking to it.
Okay,
I think that's where we started, was like, okay, there's the repair work with the child, and then there's, well, what can I be doing with it myself so that maybe I'm less reactive or less inclined to like explode, right, in any given situation. And I think you addressed the fact that like there's no version of this where it's like you're just invulnerable or infallible or where you won't be,
it's like Zen-like state where like nothing bothers you anymore. Right. Yeah.
But it's the relationship with that pain, which is what you just described, which is the place where we can do the work and actually evolve in that way. And I want to ask you about this because this occurred to me. I feel like I've had a couple of moments as a parent, since we're on this subject, where maybe instead of like, I can see the pattern of, okay, I'm being ignored, I'm not feeling respected, and that is aggravating to me, and now I'm gonna get more aggressive and louder and make some threats and whatever.
Totally, 100%.
And I still do that cycle plenty, but there have been a couple times where this has been an attempt of like, maybe I can change this pattern, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it. But I've had some times where I've said, hey, I can feel that I'm feeling frustrated because I feel like you're not listening to what I'm trying to share, and maybe we could just, instead of escalating, right? Like, can we just talk about that for a minute? Like, and what's going on with you? Like, are you feeling like, how are you feeling right now? Yeah. And just like have a dialogue that precedes the outburst or whatever. What are your thoughts on an approach like that?
I love it. I think what the hardest thing about parenting is, for any solution you give, there's about 12 other nuances that a parent would say, but what about this? Like, that wouldn't work in this situation, right? Or anything, right? So especially with like listening, right? What I believe personally is, okay, when you can have a dialogue with your kids, right? If they're not listening, right? Like, exactly what you said. Like, I would like word for word what you just said, right? Like, listen, I'm feeling frustrated, man. And it's okay that your kids know that you're frustrated at them, right? It's okay for us to voice that at them,
Right.
right? That's actually good for them to understand that like their actions have effects, right? So I'm feeling frustrated. What's going on with you, right? This is what we need to do. So there are also some situations where you just need to get their dang shoes on and get in the car, right? Or whatever, right?
Right.
And so in those cases, it's okay to just say like, listen, I've already asked you. I get you're not gonna like this, but I'm just gonna pick you up and put your shoes on, right? Or literally, this is just me. I just use some people might say like, I can't believe you're doing this. That's so shaming. I actually don't believe it is at all. But I think we are way too worried about shaming our kids growing up in parenting. Sorry, let me back up. I don't believe in shaming our kids, but I think sometimes we worry we're shaming like all the time when really we're just being a leader of the family, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like if we're in a hurry, then I'll ask my kid twice. I'll say, hey, it's time to hop in the car. Like Manning, it's my oldest name. It's time we have to hop in the car. And if he's not doing it, I'll just say, all right, Manning, that's one. And he knows that if I get to 3, then there are consequences, and he always just listens. He doesn't always just listen, but right, like so, like there are times like when we have to hurry, I'll do like the 1, 2, 3, right? If we have time, I'll sit and I'll try and have a dialogue with them. If we're in a really big hurry, I'll just pick them up and do it themselves. And I think what I'm trying to convey to parents is there's no one size fits all of how to do it. The point is, the goal is learning how to manage your own your own emotions so that you're not taking them out on your kid. If you're not doing that, then there's a lot of flexibility with how you handle these types of situations.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think it is more so of the feeling that they get from us rather than the tactics that we're using.
That's it. Yes, exactly. It's the feeling that they get from us. They either download our regulation or they download our dysregulation. So I'm like, I don't really care how you do it. My goal is just to help you do it in a way that you feel like you're regulated so that you stay connected with your kid while you do it.
That's interesting.
So good.
One of the things that I love about IFS that I've heard before is this idea of no bad parts. Like there's no bad parts of us. And you touched on that too. And I guess like, is there more that you would elaborate on that idea? Because I think that's getting into also the shame word that came up, right? It's like connected to this too. What would you say on that like theory?
Yeah, this idea that no parts of us are bad.
Yeah.
Well, let me address, I think one of the most common like questions to that is like, what about these parts of us that are obviously doing really destructive things?
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the analogies I like to use is I was talking to my kid once, right? And he was really, again, my oldest, he was really having a hard day, just like screaming, bullying his siblings, right? Like yelling, crying, right? Being really hard to deal with as a dad. And I was like, dude, what are you doing? Like, I was getting really fed up with him. And I think I threatened him a couple times, right? I'm having to go to your room, like all these wonderful things that never actually work, but I still go to him because that's me. And finally, he just breaks down and he starts crying. He says, Dad, I'm just feeling so sad. That's the emotion he used, sad, not angry, although he looked like it was anger on the surface. But underneath, he said, I'm feeling so sad because no one has played with me yet today. And in that moment, I was able to separate the problematic behavior from like this really good, beautiful kid underneath, right? And that he was just engaging the problematic behavior because he had no other way to know how to try and seek for connection. That's what we're talking about with no bad parts. So I work a lot with men who want to heal from pornography use, right? 100% of the time, they hate that part of themselves, right? And it's the early phase of the process is helping them realize, like, what if this part of you actually isn't a monster? It's not bad. It's not gross. It's not perverted. It's not weak. It's actually a part of you that's young, right? It's stuck. And it's doing what it feels like it has to in order to keep you safe. Like, are we able to separate the destructive result of the behavior from the part of you that is actually really just good underneath and is striving to find connection? And now you have an opportunity for you to go give that part the connection it's been looking for this whole time.
Yeah, the authentic connection.
The authentic
rather
connection.
Than the counterfeit.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what part it is, so whether it's rage, whether it's pornography, substance abuse, laziness, right, procrastination. Like, it doesn't matter what it is. It's a lot about learning how to separate the destructive behavior from the need for connection that part is wanting.
Okay,
So good.
I just have to share one. This is kind of in a more spiritual realm thought that's related to all
Please,
of
yeah.
this. There's this idea of the natural man, right?
Yeah.
And the natural man being an enemy to God.
Yeah.
And I think it was in a conversation with our friend Theos, who we've had on the podcast before, but he said, "And what does Jesus teach us to do with our enemies?"
Mm,
Isn't that beautiful?
that's pretty cool.
Like, you love your enemies.
Yeah.
Love your enemies. Pray for your enemy, right? And so I think of the internal world and this connection with this, philosophy around IFS. What does it look like to love the parts of us that have seemed like enemies for a long
Dang,
time?
that's so good. Theos, I don't know you, but I want to, man.
Yeah.
That is
Oh, you
so
wanna-
good.
you wanna know
I want to know that, man. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
it's powerful, right?
That's powerful.
So I love your reaction to it because I felt the same way.
Yeah,
when
that
I
was-
heard that. Yeah.
Oh, that like hit me. That's
Yeah.
really cool.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So beautiful
So
stuff.
powerful.
And I love when things resonate at all these different levels, like at the therapy or philosophy or psychology level, and then you get to these spiritual levels and there's so much connection and
Yeah.
synergy there.
Yeah.
Such
To
a
me, it just,
confirmation.
yeah, it
Totally.
just resonates. Like
Totally.
the truth resonates.
Dang,
It's
that's
awesome.
cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, we have to wrap up, but I would love for you to give any parting words, and where can people find you online?
Cool.
To
Yeah.
connect with you.
Yeah. Parting words. First off, this is really fun. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for
Thank
coming.
you.
Thanks for having me on. One thing, just parting words is a lot of people don't know where to start with this healing journey, and maybe they have operated under these beliefs or assumptions that emotions make me weak. Trauma is just a term that makes me a victim, right? All these things that you kind of brought up in the beginning, and what I tell people is, listen, where we want to go is learn how to love ourselves. The only thing worse than not having self-love is trying to force self-love, right? Just feels so fake and inauthentic and disingenuous. And so if you're in that spot where you're I don't even know where to start with this, I just tell people, what I'm going to ask you to do is just start with curiosity. Just are you willing to just get curious with the things that you do, and the things that you're feeling and thinking? Curiosity is such a powerful word, and it opens the door for a lot of healing. Because as you start to get curious with yourself, we get to suspend judgment. You don't even have to believe the things that you're learning about yourself because you're just being curious, right? It's just such a safe way to get started, but it opens the door to learn about these parts of yourself, and that naturally leads to self-compassion, and then self-compassion naturally leads to self-love, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have to force anything. So that's all I'd invite anyone to do if they're wondering where to get started. Just, are you willing to just start getting curious, right? Why do you do the things that you do? What experiences have you had growing up that could have influenced that, right? What are you actually searching for when you engage in those behaviors? You're probably searching for connection, right?
Yeah.
Love
So that'd be
it.
as far as parting words go. That's what I would say. Where to find me? So I'm on LinkedIn predominantly. The only problem is there's probably about 1,000 Michael Andersons just in
Oh,
Utah
yeah.
alone.
Yeah.
My parents blessed me with a very boring name.
Same.
Yeah, there you go.
Me too.
Yeah, there you go. Oh,
We all have very common
this
names.
is a very safe space as far as
Yeah.
boring names go. So if it's okay, I'll send you my profile link to put on the show notes.
Yeah.
If someone wants to contact me, DM me. That's the easiest way to contact me if you want to talk or book a free call and work with me. That's the easiest way to do it. And then I'm publishing the second of a children's book series.
Ooh,
That'll be, by the time this podcast airs, it'll be out.
Cool.
And
cool.
it's all about just having a resource for parents to be able to teach their kids mental health principles, leadership principles, things like that. And so that the second of the series is coming out.
What is the first part? First book.
So the series is called Jungle Tales. It's about
Okay.
jungle animals that kind of talk and do different things, right?
Cool.
The first book is called No More Mistakes. It's about the idea that it's actually okay to make mistakes. It's actually really good to make mistakes, and we don't have to be scared of making mistakes. It's how we grow. And then this second book is all about friendship, how to support one another, competition, but there's multiple ways to win, right? When you compete, and being a good friend and supporting, that's the most important way to be a winner. So that's the second book coming out.
Amazing.
Nice. Right.
Well, I can't wait to get the first one for my kids and the second.
Cool.
Thank you, Michael Anderson, for being on with us. We love this conversation, and everybody should go and follow him. He has great posts always on LinkedIn.
Thanks.
Do that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. This is
Thanks,
awesome.
All right.